My daughter cut me out of her life when she found out I had an abortion. The day after I graduated high school, my childhood sweetheart and I were married, and a year later my beautiful daughter Moira was born. When Moira was 6, I got pregnant again, but it was an ectopic pregnancy that eventually needed surgery, which included removing the fetus and part of the fallopian tube the fetus was growing in. Moira didn't know I was pregnant at the time, only that mommy had been sick and needed to be in the hospital for a little while. 3 years later my husband left me and it was just Moira and me. We were always very close, so much so that Moira sometimes called me Lorelai because we were just like the Gilmore Girls, just not as much witty banter. This was until she went to a state college about 3 hours away. We would still talk on the phone every day and she would come home for the weekend a few times a month, but I understood that she needed her space as she developed as a functional adult, so I tried to give her as much space as she needed. Sometime early in her sophomore year she joined an evangelical Christian campus group and started dating Dirk, the president of the group. This put a chill on our relationship as I go to church on Sundays at a community church that is rather liberal in its theology and generally have a live and let live attitude towards others. Too many of our calls or visits began to devolve into Moira preaching at me how I was living a sinful life and how I needed to find a man and remarry because being single was bad, and other stuff that I tried to work around to maintain the relationship as best that I could. That spring semester, the virus shut down her school, but instead of coming home, Moira moved in with a neighbor of Dirk's family, which was about 700 miles away. Our conversations went from daily to maybe twice a week and were shorter as well, as if Moira was impatient to get the calls over with. Our text messages were also almost exclusively one way, me sending her all the weird stuff I always did and her mostly just replying with one word or something like that. That summer, Moira told me she was dropping out of school and she and Dirk were engaged and they'd be building a life in Dirk's hometown. This was pretty rough news for me, but I do feel like while I tried to push back gently, I was as supportive as I could be. The wedding was in October of that year and it was a lovely event, although I felt like most of Dirk's family and the folks from his church treated me like I was a space alien. That was also the first time I had ever seen Dirk in person and spoken more than 5 words from him, and the majority of our conversation as the wedding was winding down was him encouraging me to switch to a better church for Moira's sake. After a few months, calls started to come more frequently from Moira. She was clearly struggling with adjusting to being married and not really knowing too many folks, although she always insisted that Dirk's parents and siblings and the church folks were super nice. But she wasn't working and she wasn't in school, and I think she was going a little crazy with boredom. I was sad about this but also selfishly happy to hear from her so much, and our conversation skirted theology and I didn't offer her unwanted advice, but we kept the conversations mostly light. Moira was looking forward to having children and Dirk wanted a big family, probably in part to give her more to do, but it seems that they were having difficulty conceiving. Moira told me that Dirk blamed Moira and refused to go to a doctor to check on his swimmers. It seems like his answer was to just have intimacy as often as possible, whether Moira was in the mood or not. Again, I tiptoed around the subject, and just tried to be supportive and only offered advice in areas that Moira specifically asked me for. I knew telling her what I really felt was only going to get her mad and it would be unhelpful. About 6 months ago Moira stopped complaining about how brutal it was to try and get pregnant, and even though she didn't say anything, I knew that meant that she was. I kept it to myself, just happy that she was so happy. But she called me crying right before Thanksgiving that she had miscarried. I asked her if she wanted me to come to her, and for the first time since she got married, she said yes. I was in my car less than an hour later and got there in the morning. Dirk was at work even though Moira was an absolute mess, and I did my best to comfort her. At some point, I told her about my ectopic pregnancy to let her know how awful I knew she felt. We did a lot of hugging and crying together that day. When Dirk came home, he mostly ignored us and seemed more annoyed about the whole thing than supportive. The next morning, after Dirk went to work, Moira asked me about my ectopic pregnancy, especially what had happened to the baby. I explained that they needed to abort the baby because it was growing and it could have become life-threatening to me. Moira got extremely angry at me, telling me that her pastor had once mentioned that most fallopian ectopic fetuses will actually migrate to the uterus on their own, and that I was a selfish bitch for not putting my faith in God before a soulless doctor. I was stunned and I regrettably lashed out at her, telling her that her pastor was full of poop and that as much as I wish I hadn't had to have an abortion, it was the only reasonable choice and any real Christian would understand that. Moira told me to leave the house right away. I tried to apologize, but she told me her miscarriage and trouble having children was definitely punishment for me unaliving my baby. I fled the house in tears. Since then, Moira doesn't answer my phone calls, texts, emails, anything. I found Dirk's work number, but he told me to never call again and hung up on me. I was so depressed, but I am in therapy and on medication and found a Facebook group for parents who have lost contact with children for religious reasons, so that has been a little helpful. But it's the effing worst thing I've ever dealt with. Some days I still feel like I don't have a will to live, but just thinking about my daughter gives me strength to go on, hoping that she'll let me back into her life. Whether it's because she comes to understand better what happened or because she needs me, I don't really care. I just miss her so much.